everyone. Today we're going to be talking about classical Greece, and we're going to be especially comparing ancient Sparta with ancient Athens and see their similarities and their difference. So let's begin. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. So classical Greece is considered to be the time of 467 to 27 before Common Era. Now, let's understand that there were like groups of city-states put together. So one was called the Delian League, and this was the Athenians putting together and organizing the different Greek city-states together so that if there's an attack from Persia, which was the general enemy at the time, if there was an attack from Persia, then all these city-states would unite. This is very similar to like what we have with NATO. You know, if one of the NATO members gets attacked, then all the other NATO members could come to their aid. So we had this Delian League that was established. And this was called the defense treaty. So, you know, the idea of treaties and having defense treaties is not a new thing. All right. Originally, it was voluntary for the city-states to participate, but eventually became forced on. Sparta did not want to be part of it. So they created their own. Okay. Now, the Delian League was something that each member of the league would have to pay. And, you know, who determined how much each member had to pay was decided by a man called Aristides, who was a statesman. And he would, his fairness nicknamed him, got him the name Aristides the Just. Now, the son of Miltiades, who won the Battle of Marathon, molded the league to fight the Persians. And in 467 BCE, he eventually beat them to keep them from attacking the Aegean Sea in the future. After this, the league was led by the young Pericles of Athens, who again freed the Greeks on the island of Cyprus and revolted against the Persians in Egypt. So right now, the major enemy is the Persians. But then we have Sparta. Sparta is a prominent city-state in ancient Greece. And then they rose to their dominance when showing their military strength and land power strength. So Sparta was very recognized as a leading force in unified Greek military during the Greco-Persian Wars. And they were the principal enemy of Athens during the Peloponnesian Wars. So Sparta was very focused on their military training and land power. Athens was not focused on military training. They were more focused on, you know, the arts and culture and literature and philosophy and other forms of education. But military was not one of them. So they were long-standing rivals, these two powers, the two main powers of Greece. And despite the fact that, Athens might have sent soldiers to help out Sparta during a Helot revolt, the Spartan fleet refused their help. And then we see that under Pericles, Athens tries to build a land empire in central Greece, but that threatened Sparta's traditional power. So while it didn't really last long, the attempt by Athens to increase this attempt by Athens increased tensions between the two states, and the rivalry was there. But then they signed a peace treaty in 445 BCE, and they say to each other, "We're going to stay at each other's business." Unfortunately, that didn't last for too long because then other problems arose in Corinth. Now, it's important before we proceed forward, we understand the types of government that exist. So there's an aristocracy government where you have an elite group that controls the state. Democracy is when the people participate and it's a rule by the people. Democracy is where the love of honor is the dominant motive of the ruler. So this is about the rule of wealthy. The monarchy is where you have the supreme powers held by a monarch, like a king or a queen. Oligarchies, where all the power is resting in the hands of a few people, especially those that are few that are wealthy, so ruled by a few. And then you have tyranny, where you have someone seizing power, and nobody necessarily wants them to have that power. So in terms of the Athenian and Spartan government, there was some differences. You had in the Spartan government all the different types, actually, for a while, but initially, for the most part, their government was ruled by a council made up of two kings. So this is more aristocracy. Whereas Athenian democracy went from being a monarchy to a democracy. They had all the different kinds before the monarchy. They had aristocracy, oligarchy, eventually you have the tyrants coming in. But then you had reformers come in like Solon and Cleisthenes, who really built up this notion of Athenian democracy and within the Council of 500s, with an assembly and some court systems, which is the work that you'll be continuing to do on your own. But the Spartans had the two kings, and then they had nobles that presided, a council, and then they did have a form of democracy where people that were a certain age could participate and vote, and then they had those that looked on the vote and made sure that there was they checked it and balanced that things were not being overrun. So they did have people that could veto any rulings made. It was very stable of a government this way, but they were very much a military state. So the state is above everything. But in an Athenian democracy, you have a more radical democratic government where people govern themselves. They debated and voted on great things and small things. But again, it was centered on like males only, no females participation, and certain males too. Okay. So while Athens was very forward with their military education and the power there, they're very conservative with their oligarchic government. They were the Athenians were not necessarily the same. So the Spartans sought leadership among Greek states simply in order to protect themselves rather than a desire to gain wealth. But Athens was a little different. They were a sea power, very powerful on the sea, and they were governed by more radical democracy. So they were more advanced in terms of culture and training and those things, whereas Sparta was not advanced in those areas. If we talk about the daily life in Athens, we know that the men can become participants in government. There was a lot of advancements in culture, literature, and philosophy and wealth. The men did rely on the slaves and the women to do a lot of the work. The women could not vote, hold, or own property, and they did most of the duties. They were involved in their children's education, especially for females, and educating them in spinning, weaving, and domestic arts. Women were considered to be at the ripe age of marriage at 15, which is incredibly crazy. And slaves there were many slaves. So there were more slaves than there were the free men. Some people say that as much as 40% of the people in Athens were slaves. And slaves were household servants, and they had very few rights, but sometimes those slaves could gain their freedom from a generous owner. When you have a chance, go back to this slideshow on your own and watch the daily life of an ancient Athenian on your own. So for the daily life in Sparta, men could become part of this assembly and vote in this system at the age of 30. At that point, they could marry and own a house. They could be educated in reading, fitness, and the use of weapons. The training for them began at the age of 7. They joined the military at 20, and then they can't leave the military service until they're 60. And these soldiers were given land and that were farmed by helots. Helots were the name for the slaves that they were given, the agricultural slaves that they had. Now, women could read and write. They participated in the sports and in the military training too, because they were expected to produce strong, healthy children that would become military men and be loyal to the state. So unlike Athenian women, though, Spartan women could own and control their own property, but they did not have political rights. In the Spartans, for the slaves that they had, the helots, they made up over 2/3 of the population. And most of these people were people that they captured from other places. Now, these helots attempted a revolt in 640 BC, but it was crushed because Spartan men were just way too strong. Again, when you go back, you're going to want to watch the video about the daily life in Sparta. You can see here how men, until the age of 7, they can be children. And then after that, they start being trained as military soldiers. And then at 20, they become soldiers. They can get married, but they're not moving in with their wife. They're not allowed to leave. They have to still live in their barracks. Then when they turn 30, they can go and live in their own homes with their wife, which is interesting. And they become citizens. They can vote. So this rivalry between the two sparks between the Peloponnesian League and the Delian League. So like I said, the Peloponnesian League, they dominated the land. That was the Spartans. And the Athenian Delian League, they dominated the sea. And they were very well known on the sea, especially with their triremes. Unfortunately for the Athenians and Spartans, they start something called the Peloponnesian War. Now, why did it start? Well, it started because there was a city named Corinth, and it was a very important trading city with like Athens was. But it belonged to Spartan's Peloponnesian League, and it remained very independent. And then Athens tried to interfere. And then because of this, Athens was accused of breaking their peace treaty, which provoked the Peloponnesian War to start, and then it lasted for 27 years. Now, the leader of Athens, Pericles, he built a fortress of long walls around Athens for protection. It was very long, and it was very costly, a costly war as well too for the people. Almost every city-state was aligned with one side or the other. Initially, the prospects looked good for Athens. They were strong, but then in the second year of the war, the Athenians were struck with the plague. And this happened because when the Athenians were being attacked by Sparta, they sought refuge behind this wall. And then when you're behind this wall with all these people, you end up having, unsanitary conditions. And then the disease starts to sweep across Athens. According to Thucydides, which was a poet / writer at the time, he estimated that 30 Athenians died in these 2 years, including Pericles. Pericles also died. And as a result, with Pericles out of the way, Sparta had a better chance of winning the war. In 1415, the Battle of Syracuse began with Pericles' nephew replacing him. Unfortunately, he was not very smart here because he foolishly led Athens to try to conquer Syracuse, which was an ally of Sparta. And in order to do this, he needed a lot of men and a lot of ships, all of which he lost. Unfortunately, the Armada was destroyed in 413. So not a good start for them. Then in 408 BCE, the Persians began providing ships to the Spartans. And so Athens became very desperate because they started to have not as much money coming in, and things were dwindling. And after a very small, brief victory, they realized this is their last battle here in 405, the last battle at Agios Potami. After days of battle at the sea, the Athenians stopped to collect food for their lunch. And as they did so, they were caught off guard, and their ships were burned and rounded up. They were rounded up by the sailors of the Peloponnesian League, right? So this would be the Spartans. Unfortunately for the Athenians, the Spartans spared them from severe punishment. And instead, they had to just tear down their long walls, surrender their ships, and acknowledge the Spartan leadership in matters of politics and war and the people, right? Again, you're going to want to go back and watch this video. It's just more of a visual explanation. Now, as a consequence, Spartan power is temporary, so they don't keep this power for too long. And in decline, and they start to lose their power because of their hatred of democracy, which made them extremely unpopular. As other people are starting to notice, maybe we should have this idea of democracy more and more, and their lack of having it fully made them unpopular. The age of the powerful city-states had ended, and Greece became easy prey for other stronger powers, and people were more worried about the Persian territory increasing. So then you end up with someone called Philip of Macedon, who takes advantage and ushers in the Hellenistic period, the Hellenistic age. You might remember his son, Alexander the Great, who then goes and conquers as far as, goes almost as far as India, right? And the Greek culture begins to spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Now, Thucydides was a writer of the history of the Peloponnesian War. Initially, he was an Athenian commander, but then he decides to go into exile, and he ends up writing about the events from a neutral vantage point. This is how we know a little bit of the Peloponnesian War, is because of him. Okay, so there you have it. The a little bit about classical Greece, explanations of the differences between the Spartans and the Athenians, the Peloponnesian War. You're going to continue learning about these different monumental moments in Greek history. And then if you've got any more questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Have a great day.